Yeah, hi everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes here. This is always like the boring part, sitting around waiting for it to start. Um, but I guess there's nothing against small talk before it starts. Erik and Matt, you guys, Dana, you guys can jump in as well. It's going to be an interesting presentation, the second part of the Birds of South America. I mean, all of us get interested in birds in various ways. I got interested in birds while I was stationed overseas, really got into birding. So some of the first birds I really loved were outside of the U.S. So, of course, there's not much that compares to Central and South America for bird diversity.
Yeah, Ethan, I'm learning my European birds because there's a Wingspan board game expansion pack that I got as a gift, and so it came with 200 or so European birds that I can incorporate now, and it's a lot of fun. Keeps it fresh now. So I recommend.
It's cool. I mean, if you're talking about like, I don't know if they're going to go Eastern and Western Europe, but I'm a little bit more Western European centric, and we've got great like endemics there. Some are quite rare, and then we've got some really cool migrants too, because they get all the African migrants and whatnot. So there's a lot of cool birds to pick up on, and a lot of the familiar ones that are similar to ours. I mean, they've got neat little oyster catchers and things like that, lapwings and cool rails like the corncrake. It's just and Scotland's got those really cool kites. So there's so many neat birds out there.
Okay.
And it's always a different soundscape too. Oh, we're almost ready.
I think we're about ready. We haven't had too many more people join in the last minute or so, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. This is not the birds of Europe, it's the birds of Central and South America, part 2. So this is pretty exciting. We practiced last night, and once again, these guys had a bunch of really awesome pictures and stories behind their pictures. So I'm really looking forward to this one. So for folks that aren't as familiar with Zoom, I know everybody's pretty familiar with it now here at the end of 2020, but we do get new attendees every time. So just so you all know, you folks in the audience, we cannot see or hear you. So don't worry about sitting there in your pajamas or whatever you're doing, but you can communicate with us via the chat and then the Q&A. So throughout the presentation, if a question occurs to you, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A box and we will get to it at the end. And then we might be putting resources in the chat, or if you have any technical difficulties, go ahead and let us know that in the chat. So we are the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Our mission is the conservation of birds and their habitats via science, education, and advocacy. And like most people and organizations, we've had a really unusual year this year, but we've been really excited to have this webinar series and be able to kind of connect with people and still do some of our education and outreach activities in this format. So just really briefly, obviously, you're on this webinar, you signed up for it, but people get the information in a variety of different ways. So we just wanted you to know that if you're interested in future webinars, you can go to our website. This is mrbo.org. Right on the homepage, there's this button. If you click it, it's the 2020 webinar series, which is now going to be 2021. And you'll come up with a page like this. So if you see anything that interests you, if you click read more, I'm going to pretend like I'm clicking read more. It'll pull up that event, and right here is where you can register for the event. That's always where it's going to be. I note that we actually don't have one scheduled for Tuesday, January 12th. We're kind of looking for a topic, and if you have any ideas of anything that you would like to see, please go ahead and email us. All of our contact information can also be found at mrbo.org under the contact section. So any ideas, we welcome them, whether it's for January or in the future in 2021. And so with no further commentary by me, here are our panelists this evening. Erik Ost, our field project leader here at MRBO, Matt Longabaugh, who has worked for us as a biological technician for several seasons, and Ethan Duke, the co-founder and co-director of the organization. So right now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Erik, who will take us directly to South America.
All right, thanks, Dana. All right, guys, well, everybody jump on to the next flight to Peru. That's where we're going. So just some background here. So with Birds of South America Part 1, just to recap, Matt and I went through different parts of South America, 2 different areas. Matt kind of went through all of Costa Rica pretty much, and I went through Bolivia in kind of the tropical savanna area. And so now I wanted to move towards a little closer to the equator. Ethan, Matt, and myself are all getting a little closer to the equator on this webinar. And I personally wanted to talk about this trip that I was a part of to Peru. Specifically, me and a few guys in our family, we hiked Inca Trail, which is kind of the climax at the Machu Picchu right here, which is kind of where the star is. And so a good portion of my trip to Peru, I spent there on the Inca Trail hiking and then the surrounding Cusco area. So I was in pretty high elevation in the cloud forest and montane, semi-arid region. So it was a good mix. And then I also ended the trip heading east to the Amazon in kind of south of Puerto Maldonado along the Rio Madre de Dios. And here is a really well protected reserve that has been preserved, made a sanctuary since in the year 2000. So it's really well taken care of now. And so it's a mecca for a lot of these Amazon forest birds in particular. So I'll get into some highlights of these 2 trips, bird specific, of course. So, and just so you guys see for context, I have some of the ocean right here as well, so you guys can get an idea of where we are in South America. So let's first start with the Inca Trail hike and the birds I saw there. So I picked up this pretty cheap and not very in-depth Birds of Machu Picchu book as my guide when I was there. And I didn't see all the species here, and I saw ones that weren't on it, but this was nice because I could just take it with me in my backpack and it didn't take up too much space. This was before that they had the Merlin Bird ID for my phone. So I wanted to first start out with our American Kestrel here. I know some of y'all probably recognize this immediately, but this guy was one of the most common raptors that I saw on our hike. They really like the open air, the high steep cliffs and overall open habitat that a lot of the high elevation was and the surrounding areas in Cusco and Ollantaytambo. So here's a good range map showing the Kestrel, and I mean it's pretty ubiquitous around both North and South America. So I think that it's just good to start out with this one that we're familiar with. And so then another bird that is very common, ubiquitous across South America and even up into Central America is this Rufus collared sparrow. And so this one's a juvenile. So in case anyone's ever seen one before and they don't see that striking Rufus collar, it's probably a juvenile or just like a young male. And so this guy could be seen around. This is the trail that we're walking on right here. So he's just sitting out there in the road in the trail. And another range map here to show just really likes kind of the Patagonia, so the kind of real desert, arid, and then savanna and grassland habitat up here. So they don't really like to be in the Amazon area, and so they kind of more like that open areas that it's kind of pictured in. But now we're gonna get into some more uncommon, and kind of the range is pretty isolated, which makes some of these birds pretty interesting and hard to find elsewhere. So this picture right here, you might think it's an oil just from the colors, the contrast of the yellow and the black, especially with some of these white marks on the wing. But if you take a look at that bill, that hunkin' bill, you might recognize that as a grosbeak bill. And sure enough, it is. It's a black bill, a blackback grosbeak, one of the cool species I saw there. And let's see, we'll get to its range map. I can zoom out of here. There we go. So compared to the first two species, we saw a much more narrow range map. And what's also interesting about this is in the wintering, the non-breeding habitat, it extends further into Bolivia and even into Brazil, and it's non-breeding. So this is kind of unique to the other ones where they had just more, they just had year-round displayed, but they have enough data with eBird data to show that in non-breeding, it tends to go further away from its montane regions that it likes to be in, and more in the lower elevation savanna grassland habitat, which is pretty neat. All right, this is one of my favorite birds that we saw there. This is giant hummingbird, and this was taken pretty far back. I mean, you can tell that branch is probably as thick as my finger that it's perched on, and that giant hummingbird, overall kind of a bland bird, kind of drab. Its name is, it means like drab plumage in the Quechuan tongue there, like burrow something. And anyways, this was just an awesome bird to see. I saw a few different times. It really wasn't as uncommon as you might think it is, considering it's the largest hummingbird that exists. The largest, and probably you can't get too much larger considering its size and its metabolic rate, high metabolic rate. So this guy, interestingly, first some tidbits information, it's more than double the size of our ruby-throated hummingbird. So it's about 2 times the width in its wingspan, and then more than double the length. So it's about 9 inches in length from tail to the crown. And so this was an awesome bird to see. It'll actually glide compared to other hummingbirds. It has large enough wings that it can glide more. I guess it's been documented. I haven't seen the video. It would be amazing to see, if they're gliding for multiple, beats that they would be, or if it's just that they, skip a few wing flaps, mix in a little bit of gliding with it. It'd be interesting to see. And here's that giant hummingbird range map for you. So a little bit larger than some of the other hummingbirds that we're about to see. So here's a sapphire vented puffleg, and a relatively larger size hummingbird. It has the name puffleg because there's these white kind of tufts. I call them like bell bottoms. Like this hummingbird's wearing bell bottoms, and they're white feathers that kind of shoot out and fray out to the sides like a little puff. And Matt has a better photo of another puff leg, so you can see that with better clarity. And this is another one that just prefers to be, up around 4,000 meters in the cloud forest on the eastern side. I can't remember eastern or western, but kind of really like a narrow range and elevation. And that's, you can see here on this map, it just barely goes into Colombia and then Ecuador into Peru, and just that, a strip, certain parts of the Andes. All right, and here's another hummingbird. This is a Shining Sunbeam. And characteristics of other sunbeams, they have relatively short bills. And nectar is the primary diet of or food source for most of these hummingbirds, but they will also catch insects and little flying bugs with their bill. Something interesting about the Shining Sunbeam is that they have populations in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. There's two kind of populations in Colombia and Ecuador, and there's a different population down in Peru. The one in Peru, they will breed in November and April, twice a year. But the sunbeams in Ecuador and Colombia have a breeding range that is more typical of our North American birds, but a little bit longer. So like February to September. So it's pretty interesting to see that, the ones in the Northern Hemisphere kind of mirror ours a little bit, a lot more so than this one that breeds biannually in Peru. And here's a hummingbird that I didn't include. This is from Bolivia, but I figured it would be interesting to show a comparison between range maps. So this is a gilded hummingbird, and this guy doesn't like, the cloud forest at all, likes the savanna and grassland habitat. One interesting fact is that, more than half of our hummingbirds all reside within 10 degrees of the equator. So, these type of gilded hummingbirds, ones that like the savanna and grassland, are not going to be as common, but, you're still going to have quite a diversity of hummingbirds. All right, and now we're going to get into you had some blue and white swallows here that littered around the monuments and ruins, not the monuments, the ruins of the Incan Trail. So we had several different ruins that we were able to see quite intimately on our way to Machu Picchu. And these guys were just all around there, way more birds than any people there. It was a real treat. And these guys have an interesting range map in that they will breed actually in Patagonia, far South America, and then in the non-breeding time, they can go as far north as Trinidad, island of Trinidad. So they will actually, migrate north towards the equator rather than south towards the equator. That was something that a few people were interested in when we were talking about when migration of South American birds came up. And so it just proof that I was there. There's my brother and my dad and I looking real happy and comfortable and satisfied, making it to the top and ending the trip there. And then we moved into the hot and humid Amazon, and you can just see, I can't tell if that's a fake smile or not, but it was hot and humid the whole time there. This is in Tambopada, the Tambopada Lodge and Research Station. So they conduct a lot of research at like scarlet macaws around here. And so because I mentioned macaws, one of the main attractions down in this region is the salt or clay licks that a lot of birds, upwards of 20 species will come and visit for salt and other mineral intakes. So that's down here in the south part of the screen. And this is just some photo, geo-referenced like GPS points that from photos that were taken. So just shows you kind of where we were. We followed the river. That's the only way you can travel around this part. So, it takes 3 hours to get to our lodge, but let's get on to the clay lick. So here we have, blue and yellow, red and green macaws, scarlet macaws, I think are the only three that are pictured. And so every morning, kind of weather dependent, boatloads of birds, it depends if they're little parrotlets, there could be hundreds. If there's these macaws, there could be 50, 60. I think there are, up close to 100, I think, of different macaws throughout the time I was there. Some coming in for a little bit, some leaving. They'd stay 15, 20 minutes maybe, and then, leave for the rest of the day. And so in the morning, there's just this cacophony of, macaws just shrieking and just calling, and it's just amazing to see. And you can get pretty close to these guys. You're kind of shrouded in some vegetation, and they're across the bank from you. And so here's another shot. So we still had that blue and yellow, a lot of blue-headed parrots, and then orange-cheeked, I think, are most of these ones up here. So the blue-headed, and then these all like orange cheeks. They're hard to tell with this, but there's some down here. So yeah, that was a real big highlight, seeing those guys. You know, a bunch of different macaws and parrots. Just really neat to see that, all that brilliant colors and the sounds, and it's just a real highlight and a treat. So I really recommend going there if you can. And then just to wrap it up, a couple photos of other wildlife there that are noteworthy. So we have this giant river otter. So one of the most endangered or imperiled neotropical mammals. And so these guys, I mean, they're big. These guys are real big guys. Don't want to mess with these ones. So I was happy to get a good shot away, you know, across 50 feet away. But they were swimming around there in the river, and then also had a treat to see this jaguar. So there were two that were on this bank when we were turning, and had a decent view of them. But as soon as we saw them, they kind of just stealthily kind of scattered off, and you know, it was really quiet, and just got a brief look at them enough to get this photo, and that was it. And we were with with tour guides there, and she said she hadn't seen one in a whole year, and she took that all the time this ride. So it was such a treat to see that. So I figured I'd just end with the jaguar. And anyway, so that's it as far as my presentation goes. So now we're going to move into Ecuador with Ethan's presentation, and then Matt's. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ethan.
Okay, let me get my screen up here. To do my thanks for the introduction earlier, Dana. Appreciate that. And a little advert about Merbo, as I'm a co-founder and co-director. This first picture here, I'm pretty excited about this presentation because I'm really passionate about nature and conservation and advocacy, and I feel strongly that everybody can do that, and you can do that through your travels as these guys have done. And it makes it so much more enjoyable. And another aspect, Dana showed that picture of me earlier. When you go to these really remote areas, you also have the benefit of wearing anything you want. Nobody will laugh at you. So that's sort of a thing there. I'll cover these areas here. Put a little star. Oop, that little star is a little bit far to the left. It should be just southeast down in Belize. It got moved around on me. But so we'll do a little bit of Belize, and then way down here in these little islands about 600 miles west of the equatorial mainland, we will see these beautiful Galapagos Islands, a whole pile of them there. And I did have some things I'd like to share, but I won't, from going inland towards where Erik was, actually seeing those beautiful things like those clay licks and some of the sounds of that really kind of interior rainforest that's really remote and special. Here's a sound. Just kind of the nice sounds of interior rainforest there. That was a long-billed wood creeper. I get really distracted looking at recordings from Central and South America. But if we look here at this map, we'll see Belize. And outside of Belize, you'll see Turnef Atoll. There's a famous diving spot called the Blue Hole, and there's wonderful marine things and some island bird sanctuaries and Audubon sanctuary out there as well. But we're going to explore the mainland interior here. So if you go in, there's Turnef again. If you go in from Belize City into this Mountain Pine Range Forest Reserve, it's about 2.5, more like 3 hours to get in there. And it's a pretty neat habitat, but that's basically where it's located. The border of Honduras is right there. Honduras is much more populous, and then it's a little bit less densely populated in Belize. Um, I guess I'd like to share a couple tips along the way. And one is, if you're lucky, you'll find a good guide. We lucked out with this one. It was a really helpful guide and really friendly. We got talking about his bird jobs and things, and we mentioned, hey, we had a Merbo employee that worked over there, and his name was Will. He's like, you know Will Britton? We're like, yeah, he worked with Merbo. He's like, he gave me this camera right here. And it just goes to show what kind of a small world it is, and how it's so nice to make those interpersonal connections. And of course, these guys were also really tied into conservation, so you can find more out about the conservation of the area. Right there in that photo that Dana took, we're walking down into kind of the more moist and mesic jungle type atmosphere, but up on the ridge tops of the Pine Ridge Forest Reserve, there's acorn woodpeckers and all sorts of other cool birds. Even without the guide, in the tropics, birds are everywhere. And so we found this like brown thrush. It's basically a robin just hopping around. We had oven birds hopping around like they were yard birds. We had these little birds walking back and forth between the main lodge and where we stayed. Our favorite local yokels. I mean, they were just like dripping from the trees. They're little black-throated green warblers. I'm like, hey guys, nice to see you. It's too bad you don't sing down here, but it's nice to see you anyways. Another close encounter that was just right by our lodge, and sometimes these birds can be really sneaky, and sometimes they just hang out for a while like this one did, and you can really get to observe this lineated woodpecker, and really a close cousin to our pileated woodpecker. Was just a real treat to see. It's kind of like a cross between a sapsucker and a pileated in its markings, but what a gorgeous, beautiful, pleasant bird to be around. And then, yeah, there's just more sneaky ones. I caught a glimpse, I heard the sound, and this guy came diving on by. And I got this lucky kind of photo of it moving, and you can sort of see its beautiful tail in that squirrel cuckoo's tail. And you can sort of see it there as well. Just really neat birds and other really cool sounds and things. And you look forever, and then you'll see something like this. And of course, not a great photo. I didn't bring high-end optics out there, but you can tell that's a yellow-throated euphonia. Really cute birds. It's like little balls of birds, and other cute birds out there, like this red-faced mannequin female is around. And that was kind of a opportunistic thing, lucky, to sort of poking around by the euphonias to find that. And so you can have a lot of skills or no skills and still kind of luck out. And this one was just a matter of luck. And then sometimes using a little bit more skills, you take advantage of the natural features, and you'll find things like leafcutter ant mounds and things like that, where you can look around, or fruiting trees, little micro habitats. And Dana and I were looking at these leafcutter ant mounds. We turned around, and there's this beautiful slaty-tailed trogon just sitting like 10 feet above our heads. And it was just such a pleasant sight to see. So those are just kind of the tips and things about it. That was a wonderful trip, and I'm only going to take a 10-minute window out of this presentation, because these guys have spent a lot more time there than I have. But a couple more tips is, you can see Ecuador here, and you can see Quito in relation to the Galapagos Islands. And so there's a lot of little transit things involved. So you always want to take advantage of kind of the transit. So out here in Quito, Erik brought up that really cool range map with Rufus collared sparrow, and how it didn't like being down in the Amazon. It liked those really open habitats. And I should have thrown a picture of the city of Quito in there, but it's quite populous and kind of dingy. But it's got some really beautiful historic components to it. But down there, I recorded this bird. I'm not going to share the whole recording, but it's such a nice sound. And in parts of it, you can hear motorcycles and people talking. And I mean, that bird can really belt it out over all the city noises and everything too. Really early in the morning there. So let's look at these Galapagos Islands really kind of quickly, because I mean, we could spend years looking at photos and listening to recordings from this area. But for those of us in the biological realm, it's kind of close to history for us, and we think of it as kind of getting close to history. And also it's a great conservation resource. Here's a picture of my passport. And actually, there's a few places in Ecuador where you get a special stamp, and like this Galapagos one, and you pay a little extra and you support conservation. It's pretty neat, and it's all the guides and everybody there. That's kind of their whole focus is conservation. So it's pretty neat to have that aspect. But getting back to the history, of course, Charles Darwin really helped form those theories, the early histories of natural selection. And one of the study organisms was these finches that happened to exist on all these different islands there. And there is one of those types of finches. This is on Chatham, old Chatham there. And you can see Dana's foot right there. I mean, they just come right up to you. And here's like kind of an excerpt from Darwin's book explaining the different finch beaks and how they evolved through natural selection to have those different features. Classic example of that sort of thing. This Beak of the Finch book, which I would suggest is a Pulitzer Prize winner that really covers 20, 30 years of study of the finches after Darwin, more in modern times, and sort of re-examining his theory and how it applies and what we've learned from it. Here's me my recording kit, and here's one of those sparrows, or finches, right there, right next to us. So that's about as close to history as one can get. As you're traveling around the Galapagos Islands, of course, you go to these different islands, you're going to find different birds, so you have a different preference for different islands. And this particular one in the foreground, you can see a couple birds sitting up in these kind of shrubby bushes. And those are little colonies of red-footed boobies. And like the finches, you actually can get quite close to them. And they're just absolutely adorable, cool looking seabirds with remarkable habits and pretty resilient bird. They haven't always done well, but thanks to efforts on the islands to halt development, they're doing that good. And there's a few different types of boobies on these islands. Here's another example of Nazca booby and getting super up close to them. This bird is so comfortable with me sitting next to it. It's actually just sitting there preening while it has a baby and an egg under it. It's amazing. Dana and I are sitting right next to him. They're making those nice sounds. All these bill clacks, all these little bill clacks and things. Pretty intimate and close, but it's a dream trip. There's so much to cover with that. But I love this picture of this Galapagos hawk on the sign here. And we had a friend that studied the Galapagos hawk, so it's kind of special to see it. And these Galapagos mockingbirds on every island, a different one, very similar to the finches. And it just makes me wonder how much more they have yet to teach us and how much we could learn. But the overall message there is these places like this that these guys are showing you and I'm showing you, they not only need to be conserved, they need to be preserved. They're just that special. And that should be taking up my whole 10 minutes, guys. I think that should pretty much cover it. We'll segue into Matt here, who has got way better photographs and has spent more time there.
Okay. So moving 563 miles east from the Galapagos, here are the birds of mainland Ecuador. So last winter, I had the opportunity to work for a biological consultant in this little town of Puyo, kind of in the Andean foothills of eastern Ecuador. So I birded a little bit around there, you know, kind of on my days off. I took a little field trip up in the Andes here, and then kind of went up in the cloud forest north of Quito and to the coast right before I went home. So unfortunately, I didn't get into the Amazon. I mean, the infrastructure just gets a lot trickier and much more expensive, kind of once you get east of these Andean foothills. So I have a reason to go back now to visit all the birds I missed out on Amazonian Ecuador. Anyway, so here is downtown Puyo. This is where I lived for about 3 months. And this is just outside of town. And you can see, I mean, just how lush. This is all jungle coming right up next to the city. This is my hot rod that I cruised around the streets of Puyo for a few months on. And we'll get into the birds of Puyo. So I think the next morning after I rolled into Puyo, Antonio, the guy I was working with, said, "Hey, come see these red-breasted meadowlarks. You're really gonna love them." And they were awesome. He was absolutely right. So this is just like our eastern and western meadowlarks, same genus, but just super striking coloration on the males. Gorgeous birds. Silver-beaked tanager. So these, like you saw with Erik, these this tanager is common throughout most of South America. They were thick around Puyo for sure. Palm tanager is another really common tanager. These are consistently up in the cecropias, eating fruit and little bugs. These are a really common yard bird, common garden bird too. And this is a great antrike. This is one of my favorite birds that I saw the whole time. And I actually recorded this guy. I've been hearing that for days while I was surveying this property. I kept hearing that, and it took me a couple days. So eventually I figured out what it was, but I couldn't get him to come up. And then finally, after days and days, I've finally caught him popping up and snapped his picture. So that's the male there. There's a brownish female skulking nearby too. Roadside hawk. So these, we talked about these a couple weeks ago too in part 1. So this is a really common raptor all throughout the tropics. It was lumped in Buteo with our red-tailed hawks until it got booted out. So now he's in his own little group. But these just adorable little raptors, they love sitting on telephone poles, just like our red tails. It was unusual to see one up in a tree. Actually, I have a million photos of them sitting on a lot less aesthetically pleasing utility poles, but I definitely saved the one where he's in some prettier habitat. And this is a Huatzin. So these weren't necessarily common around Puyo. I for a day went to a little lower elevation where they got a little bit more of the kind of Amazonian proper birds. And we took a little tour of this kind of lagoon by canoe, and these Huatzins are clambering through the trees, just making an awful ruckus. And I was so happy. I before going, I kind of had a short list of about five birds that I wanted to see in Ecuador, and this Huatzin was was one of them. So here's this little one here has claws on his wings that they lose as they grow older, but the young ones are kind of famous for using those claws to scramble up trees. Since they're near water so often, they'll climb up a tree sticking out of the water to get to safety. A lot of folks call these stink birds, since they are vegetarian, strictly vegetarian. They have this weird, really unique digestive system that a lot of folks compare to cows, where they the leaves that they eat kind of ferment in their digestive system. So they have this really funky odor. So I talked to more than one birding guide who was able to smell these. I mean, before you ever saw them. So we were in this kind of flock of 40 or 50 Watsons, and it was funky for sure. Smooth-billed anis. So these were ubiquitous around Puyo. Every day you hear, more and more birds declining, but this one in particular actually is increasing. So as these forests are leveled for agriculture, these smooth-billed anis have done really well. They like that open area. So the smooth-billed ani population is at its peak right now. They're loving it. And they were just all over the place. These little flocks of 15 to 20 birds, noisy little things. They're so cute. Andean cock of the rock. So this is another one in kind of my top 5 birds to see in Ecuador. Busted my camera up real good trying to get this shot. So they live in these ravines. They like to kind of attach their nests to cliffs. And I was lucky enough to meet up with a group of birders around Puyo who asked if I had seen cock of the rock yet, and I said no. And so the next day we made plans for them to get me on a cock of the rock, and we hiked down kind of into this ravine, and I slipped on a wet rock and landed right on my keister, but the front of my camera came down on that rock too. So I'll always have a little keepsake on my dinged up camera, plus this photo, which is about the only good one I got. But this male kept following us around and watching us. It's just incredible bird. Here's just a few of the kind of North American migrants that were hanging around Puyo. Swallow-tailed kites were in the air every day, along with black vultures. I mean, hundreds of black vultures per day. Blackpool warblers were kind of the most common warbler at this particular location. So a lot of blackpolls. Summer tanagers were thick. There's a couple scarlet tanagers mixed in there too. Vermilion flycatcher, solitary sandpiper, and house wrens. So from Puyo, I went with this group of birders up to this volcano called Antisana, which is just east of Quito. So this is the kind of summit of Antisana here. There's a little crater in there somewhere. But here, where I'm standing, is in front of this little lake, just to the right of this photo. And the elevation here is like 14,000 feet. So we're up there. It is super, super cold, super wet. I hadn't seen a tree for hours. I mean, the only vegetation there is grass and moss, and it was just like being on a alien planet. I've never been birding in a habitat like that before or since. It was amazing. Just some weirdo oddball birds up there. They have a couple different species of these Sierra finches and ant pittas. I mean, they're all using kind of clumps and moss for cover. I mean, there's none of these birds are used to using any tall trees or vegetation at all. These stout-billed synclodes were kind of clambering over the rocks, checking us out. They were pretty bold, really, really cute, charismatic little birds. And then these lakes kind of strewn across these Andes, these high elevation lakes, have their own set of birds. So these yellow-billed pintails and Andean teals are only found in these frigid lakes way up in the Andes. There's a couple species of grebes. There's a grebe called silvery grebe, which I didn't get photos of, that live in these lakes way up there. Andean gulls, just like our Franklin's gulls. There's a couple small flocks of these guys hanging around that lake. And there's this Ecuadorian hill star, is a hummingbird, almost endemic to Ecuador. There's just a tiny little patch of them that kind of make it into the Colombian Andes. And I think the adult males are really, really vivid, kind of purple and white. But you can see, I think this is a young one, because we saw a little nest nearby. But you see how well he blends in to this kind of mossy stuff here. I mean, we walked by this bird a couple times before anybody saw him clinging to this rock. And here's the Andean condor. So this is kind of the bird for many birders visiting mainland Ecuador. It's Ecuador's national bird. It's one of the largest flying birds on Earth. There are a couple birds that have a wider wingspan, and there are a couple birds that are a little bit heavier, but no bird is as large when combining both wingspan and weight. And they are having a rough time with farmers poisoning food, kind of up in the Andes. Andean condors have not evolved to withstand much fatality. I mean, they have very few predators up there, and that population just can't handle losing birds due to human intervention. So there's several countries, including the United States, that are captive breeding Andean condors. Kind of while I was putting this slide together, there's a experiment in the U.S. where they kind of captive bred and raised some Andean condors and then turned them loose in California, just kind of see how they did, and they did great. So they caught them again and turned them loose up in the Andes where they belong. And as far as I could tell, that was largely successful. So there's work being done, but they certainly need all the help they can get. And they're not the only ones. So there's a lot of these big birds of the high Andes that need all the help they can get. This Andean ibis is hurting. Super beautiful, kind of weird birds probing the grasslands, 15,000 feet up in the air. And carunculated caracara too. So this is a falcon that scavenges on whatever it can find, including sometimes poison meat, possibly. So here was Antisana right here. Northwest of Quito, there's some cloud forest kind of in this kind of middle elevation up here. So I had the pleasure of staying at a lodge up here for a week and a half maybe. But this lodge really catered to birders, so it was kind of a birder's dream. They had these signs posted along a couple of the trails. And here's what the habitat looked like. So it was multiple kind of rainstorms per day. You see, I have my camera in a plastic bag here to keep it from getting soaked. But it was great. So here's a Rufus collared sparrow, which like both Erik and Ethan had. I mean, there's a couple of those hanging out by this lodge, and they were my alarm clock every morning. They started whistling, tell me to get out of bed and get birding. Great thrush, just like our American robin, but larger. I mean, this dude was huge. Mast, flower piercer. So in a minute, we'll see the feeders that they had at this lodge, which were 4 hummingbirds. But these mast flower piercers had the system figured out. They could come stick their little beaks in these hummingbird feeders and suck out the nectar. So here's the female. So normally in the wild, she uses this little hook on her bill to pierce flowers and rob it of nectar. But why do that when there's a dish of nectar sitting out at the hotel for you? Here's golden-headed Quetzal, strong-billed wood creeper, tons of wood creeper species up in the mountains. This guy I recorded. I took so many recordings up here. They didn't have Wi-Fi. I didn't know that until I got there. So I had nothing to do but record birds all day long. So I have hundreds of recordings from this lodge up in the mountains. Plate-billed mountain toucan. I recorded this one too. So just after that cuts off, a couple start doing that back and forth, and they get themselves pretty wound up. But just gorgeous toucans up there. Blackburnian warbler was the most common at this location. I saw more Blackburnians kind of in the cloud forests of Ecuador than I had seen in my entire life in the US combined. Cinnamon flycatchers, really beautiful. Green and black fruit eater is a cotinga, just like the cock of the rock. There's a really weird family called Cotingidae. Just a bunch of oddball fruit-eating birds. And then this Mast trogon, which I photographed day after day. So this hotel had an insect wall that they'd illuminate at night. So all these ecotourists could come see all these tropical bugs that would cling to this sheet at night. And in the morning, this Mast trogon was on cleanup duty. So I took hundreds of photos of this. This is one male. I mean, there's only one bird around, and he'd so used to people that he'd come sit on a branch and fly down and eat a couple bugs. You could stand right there and not bug him. Here's him. So he made these kind of gentle little squeaks, but the wrens in the background kind of dominated that recording. And then here's the hummingbird feeders that this hotel was famous for. And there's a couple hotels there in this valley that was really conducive to hummingbird diversity. So there's lesser violet ears, rocket tails. So this is the same puff leg group that Erik had earlier. Purple bibbed white tip, green-backed hill star, Gould's jewel front. I mean, just so many. I mean, I think on any given day it was 14 was the number of hummingbirds present, and some would come and go kind of with the seasons, but 14 hummingbirds was great. Fork-tailed wood nymph is purple overall with a green gorget. But this was a piece de resistance for birders in northwest Ecuador is this violet-tailed sylph. Just beautiful, and it only looked like this kind of when the light hits it just right. So I mean, when it's flitting through the forest, the tail looks kind of black, and then it sits in the sun, and the sun hits those tail feathers, and there's nothing like it. So here's a short video of the feeders there at the hotel. So I'm sure the staff there went through gallons of hummingbird nectar a day. I mean, I saw them refilling these things 3, 4, 5 times a day to keep these little hungry hummingbirds fed. And from there, last but not least, I took a trip down to the coast in western Ecuador to Puerto Lopez. Little beach town. Birding was hard there. It was rough to see all the birds past my pina coladas and ceviche, but I managed. So here's just a quick little climate classification map. Puerto Lopez is right here in this arid desert area. So I mean, after all I had been through, this kind of put the hurt on me for a couple days. I hadn't been drinking enough water. I had been in tropical rainforest for months, and then I got to this arid area on the coast, and it took me a couple days to adjust. It was just a thorny, scrubby, hot. I mean, consistently in the upper 90s. So this is an island, 15 miles off the coast that I went to, just off Puerto Lopez. So here's some of the arid West Coast birds. West Peruvian dove. This was split from our white-winged dove in 1997, so it was kind of nice to see almost a familiar face. Neotropic cormorants. These are all beach birds. Collared plovers running along the beach. Lesser nighthawks strewn all across the beach. I kept flushing them from like a foot away. I was really nervous that I was going to squish one. They're just thick, and they scare the daylights out of you when they flush right at your feet. Mast water tyrant is a little flycatcher that kind of ran along the ground and picked little bugs out of the debris. A couple croaking ground doves. Blue-footed boobies out the wazoo. I mean, I could sit on that beach and watch 20 or 30 boobies follow these fishing boats in from sea. And I visited this little island called Isla de la Plata that was covered with blue-footed boobies and one red-billed tropic bird. So this was kind of the last of my 5 must-see birds in Ecuador. Was a tropic bird, just because I had so many unsuccessful attempts in the U.S. I was dying to see a tropic bird, and one was kind of soaring over these cliffs, 15 miles offshore. So it was just a great way to cap off the end of my trip with this beautiful tropic bird. And that is all I have, I'm sorry to say. So if you have any questions or comments or anything, we'd love to hear them.
It looks like you guys have a couple questions in the chat and a couple in the Q&A. But Matt, I just want to confirm that last part of your trip there, you actually ended up coming back right as coronavirus started this year. Is that correct?
Yep, I was on the beach there at Puerto Lopez, and kind of hurried back to Quito. I had planned to stay, a week longer or whatever, and hurried back to Quito. I thought I was going to get stuck in Quito, and made it, kind of came back just as flights started getting canceled. And so, yeah, I made it back just in the nick of time.
Matt, and that reminds me, I think you told me a story, a couple people that you met there that were birding, they didn't make it and they got stuck.
There was a woman and her brother that I met at this hostel in Quito who decided to wait a few days after I had left, and they emailed me it was like a month later. They emailed me and asked me for bird photos because they had seen me taking pictures and said, "Hey, we'd love to see some of your photos you took." And I asked them how they're doing. And they said, "Oh, we're still in Quito. We've seen everything there is to see in Quito, and they won't let us. We can't fly back yet." So I was cutting it close.
That's a travel adventure right there.
Yes, our friend Jeff Cantrell says in the chat that he has travel fever now. And he's spent quite a lot of time in the tropics, I believe. So if you guys want to check out the Q&As, we've got a question about the Watsons. And then I think what Matt mentioned about the problems with conservation.
I haven't, stuck my nose around Watson. We had a bunch of them down there when we were up to Napo, but I don't remember. I remember them being called stink birds. I don't know. Do you guys ever smell them?
Well, Matt probably has a little bit more experience. I only had one encounter with them, and it was just in a real swampy bog. So it just, kind of smell of just kind of like sulfur and decomposition overall was like what I smelled there. So I don't know if that was the Hoatzin or what, but that's all I could smell.
What it kind of reminded me of, I had been birding before where javelina are present, and they kind of have this like hoggy musk to them that they exude, and it kind of smelled like hogs, just kind of this funky. I don't know how to describe it, but that's what it reminded me of, being there.
I wonder if it has a benefit to them for predators or whatever. Being like, I don't think I'm gonna eat that thing.
I don't know.
I think I can maybe answer my mom's question. She asked maybe to you, Matt, why the farmers poison them, and I think it's to deter predators of their farm animals or their livestock. So they'll set out food that predators will come and take, but then those things die, and then the vulture or the condor will come by and pick it off, just like our eagles, and then they suffer from the lead or whatever poison is in there, because it might not be enough to kill them, but it's enough to harm them significantly enough that they, their fitness goes down and their eggs can't, hatch right or what. So
I should have clarified. I don't think they're trying to poison the condors themselves. I think it's a lot like, when people use rodenticide and, down the line, an owl scoops up a poisoned mouse and then the bird gets sick. I think that's kind of the same deal.
Yeah, it's an international raptor conservation. Both the eagles, hawks, and vultures, particular. Like the ones in India have a tough time with. Farmers in India or people in India love their cow, their sacred cow, and so they try to not have them go through pain. So they give them this pain medication. Well, that ends up the food chain and has a big impact on the raptors there. And you know, there's different problems like that all over, and it's really sad to see our apex and great scavengers taking the toll from it. It happens elsewhere too. In Africa, it's poachers. You know, the vultures give away. They're circling around, giving away their kill sites where they've been poaching animals, so they shoot them, so they don't give them away. So each region seems to have its own little quirky things that need to have its own solutions.
Vultures and condors are sadly misunderstood and often mistreated because of that, I think, whether it's accidental or purposeful. Very much relatedly, Steve asks, how do you guys feel these countries are doing with bird conservation efforts compared to the States? Did you get a sense that locals care greatly about their birds and wildlands, or is birding to them more important just for tourism dollars? Great question.
I can answer. I was thinking about this already. So I could say from the two places I've really been, Peru and Bolivia, their conservation efforts are not there, and they're not even the values, conservation value is not really there for the community too. And when I was there with the blue-throated macaw conservation project, a lot of their work was also, you know, just like Murbo's education, and it's really trying to drill into the kids how important their, you know, the habitat they have there and nature just as a, you know, a value. And that part was really tough, and I could see it. And so it's all just trying to tap the resources. Like if I had chainsaws every day, I heard it's just removing more of the natural habitat there. And but like Peru in particular, one instance I can think of are scarlet macaws. So in Peru, they have put a lot more money towards conservation. And this is from just looking at what each country has done in terms of like designating areas as sanctuaries or you know, protecting areas, and also showing in certain decrees like that they value the natural resources that the natives can use too. They understand that, you know, it's not just for their modernized culture that they can, you know, tap it all. And so with the scarlet macaws, they noticed at the Tambopata Research Center, they actually found out this, that scarlet macaws are limited in their breeding by the cavities that are around. So cavity availability, you know, large cavities are just far and few, and they become, you know, less and less as deforestation goes on. And so, you know, scarlet macaws don't even breed if there aren't cavities. So it's not that they breed every single year. So it's just that type of information. That's something that's coming out of Peru. And I just, not that I'm tuned in as much as Bolivia, but just from a few experiences I have, I would say Peru much higher, Bolivia much lower. But, you know, I'd say they're all realizing the potential of the money that birding brings in. And, you know, so just in the time that I was in Bolivia, they came out with the Bolivia Bird Field Guide, and Merlin's come out with all their photo ID app guides. And so there is definitely a big market and for ecotourism. And I think that is the values of conservation are really shared by the people who are running the ecotours. And that's becoming more and more of a business that locals and even immigrants, I know a lot of other immigrants like from Europe will start conservation, you know, lodges, or Americans start some of these places that really cater to the birders and maybe are that medium between, you know, the locals there and the foreigners bringing in money. And so I don't know. I definitely see it as positive. and increasingly, but it's still like the rate. I'm sure you, like Matt and Ethan, you can speak on how much like just trash in these cities and how far behind like U.S. conservation efforts overall as a whole are carried out there. I know I went off, so.
And there's a bunch of small good examples of successful things. I know that in Missouri, the late Brad Jacobs has involved a project called Southern Wings that focused on where Missouri birds went, and they really found the nexus between the communities, finding the ways for the communities themselves to profit off and deliver the conservation. And this exists elsewhere. And I failed to mention it about our little trip that went up the Napo. What important part was that to get with there was a Quechua tribe there, and they were pretty close to some non-contact tribes or historically non-contact tribes. And there was conservation kind of centers and nature centers and things that were entwined both the natural history education along with the cultural history education. So the people had a way of also preserving those institutions themselves. And I'm sure that's the model that'll be the most successful in the long run at that level. And the other side of the spectrum, we have to keep doing what we do in our not quite third world countries, in our consumer habits, to stop the drive and demand for gobbling up those resources and using them so cheaply. So there's a couple different aspects to it. I'm not sure, but Matt spent a bunch more time in some different areas, and maybe he has.
Hey,
other insights.
Before Matt goes, can you just briefly just expound, like when you say that, because what came to mind was industrial scale agricultural practices that are often going to export, as opposed to local people.
Yeah, the same practices down there that are destroying the environment are also crushing our American farmers. You know, these big, huge conglomerates, JBS and these Brazilians, impact. They've just taken over our markets, and the guys that our ranchers contribute money to a beef checkoff program that removes labeling and also supports these big, huge industrial operations that are crushing their own, stateside farming. So, I mean, there's our consumer habits participate directly in that. That's why they're able to do it, because we just want to buy the cheapest meat possible. That's the bottom of the line. We have to be conservation oriented in our lifestyle if we're going to make change on both ends of things.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I think you guys pretty much nailed it. It is amazing to have visited Costa Rica, who is 50 whatever years ahead of the curve, and knows the value of conserving and preserving a lot of these areas, versus Ecuador, who was just now maybe beginning to think about it. I mean, I had was kind of meeting young birders who wanted to go on to be professional birding guides, and that was weird. The consultant that I worked with, the kind of city government there did not like this guy. I mean, they kind of gave him a tough time, trying to collect data. Was kind of rough going in Ecuador. Granted, the city we were in was not a tourist city, so it kind of took him a little bit to kind of get used to my involvement at all. But yeah, it was pretty stark difference to kind of what I was accustomed to in Costa Rica.
Matt, just to follow up, so when you say that you were meeting these young birders, were these Ecuadorians that you met up with to go to see the Andean ibis, like on that trip? Were those all native Ecuadorians, or?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, I just got on eBird and said, oh, who else is out and about around here?
Another thing that I failed to mention, this kind of abstractly, is that we showed some snippets of those recordings. I particularly enjoyed that one from Matt where you could hear the wrens and things in the background, even though he didn't want that, because that soundscape, especially during these pandemic times when a bunch of people have that fever to want to go travel, that really does sort of define that whole experience, whatever the soundscape of a particular area. So the recordings of the Galapagos that I was just getting lost in before this presentation, or just because you can hear the waves crashing, you can hear the sea lions growling and barking, you can hear all these things. You get into the rainforest and all of a sudden it's a whole different thing with those weird peeping sounds. You got the caciques going bazonkers over here and a couple wood creepers over here, and then these insects that are singing like wow, and then all of a sudden you got some howler monkeys way out in the distance. And then all of a sudden the macaws are flying overhead. It's just it's another way to understand and experience these places acoustically, and it's a different world, even though we're all on the same little planet. It sort of emphasizes how special these places are.
Guys, it looks like we have one last question from Jeff, and it makes me super glad I'm not a panelist right now. I'm just moderator. Any advice on wood creeper ID?
I take a photo of every wood creeper I saw, and luckily in Bolivia we only had like 15, so it wasn't too. They all, the scythe bill, thick, strong build. Like there was not
ivory build.
It wasn't too many, so I took photos. So that's my advice. I haven't been in Matt's setting where there's 20, 30 something wood creepers there.
Well, I don't know. I think most of the time you can break it. I mean, break it down to range, and you'll out of Costa Rica or out of Ecuador or wherever you are, out of the entire 40 wood creepers that are there at any given location, there's probably only 6. I don't know. And I think most of them are distinguishable by voice. I think they're pretty. I think most of them are pretty varied as far as their vocalizations. But I kind of, where I was, made a short list of the wood creepers that were there, and tried to record them and tried to hear them if I could. But then instead of fighting with 30 wood creepers, you're only deciding between, out of that list of 6, 2 are significantly larger than the other. Then you're only trying to decide if it was powerful wood creeper or strong build wood creeper, and then you're only deciding between 2 is kind of how I go about it, I guess.
Makes you happy that we just have one creeper here, just our brown creeper.
That's a pretty special bird, but from what I understand, it's not closely related to those ones down there at all, really. But they look a lot alike. They're just minis,
Yeah.
It's a mini. And any woodpecker, Jeff, that or wood creeper that I see down there, I just say that's not a brown creeper.
We'll send our photos of wood creepers for IDing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And vice versa.
We'll have a wood creeper ID forum. I'm sure that'll.
Hey, there's your webinar, your missing webinar.
We're gonna have to do more field research to build more content for it.
Matt, you're teaching that one then.
Oh, I'm busy today.
All right, you guys, we're out of questions and we've kept folks a bit over, so we'll end. But thank you.
Thanks,
all of you.
everybody. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, guys.